the Jet Setting Wealth Advisory Podcast, where your financial journey takes flight with David T.U. As an airline pilot and financial expert, David merges the aviation industry and wealth management to help you navigate today's complex financial skies. Each episode features expert insight, blending personal stories with essential financial strategies. We ask that you fasten your seatbelts and sit back as we prepare for takeoff. Our destination, your financial empowerment.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to Jet Setting Wealth Advisory. I'm your host, David T.U. Today's guest is Mr. Chris Baur, President and CEO of Hughes Aerospace Corporation, one of the world's leading air navigation service providers. Chris brings over 4 decades of aviation experience, from flying airliners, who he's currently flying the Boeing 787 on the captain's seat, and he has flown helicopters, to pioneering advanced flight procedures designed for both fixed-wing and vertical operations around the world. A retired military aviator who served in the Army, Coast Guard, and the Air Force, Chris is also a technical pilot, flight test pilot, instructor, and flight inspector, holding 12 different type ratings and certifications across both manned and unmanned aircraft. Amongst his many distinctions, he has led the longest helicopter oceanic rescue mission in history and was awarded the Medal of Valor by the U.S. Attorney General's Office. At Hughes Aerospace, Chris continues to lead innovation in performance-based navigation, helicopter certification, UAS integration, and obstacle validation, designing safer, smarter airspace solutions across the globe. So lots of stuff there for people who are listeners and viewers to chew on. Hi, Chris. So welcome to the show. It's a real honor to have you here.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. And boy, oh boy, you listen to that long-winded intro about me like, hey, who the hell is this guy? But
well, we're curious to get started.
I just never could hold a job. I think that's really what that was.
You know what it is? Yeah, it's you outgrow all these positions that you've had. We're excited to get to know you more. So let's start off, Chris. You've had an incredible 40 plus years in aviation, from airline captain, again, currently active airline pilot for one of the largest airlines in the world, serving a flying captain seat, to rescue missions, to leading a global air navigation service company. What first drew you to aviation, and how did that evolve into finding Hughes Aerospace?
Wow, what a great and powerful question. And when I was a small child, I think watching planes as a little boy developed a fascination with, someday could I fly and be a pilot? And I think I fell into the whole thing. And growing up, Amelia Earhart was my childhood hero, and I had a fascination with her disappearance. And I just knew that's all that I was interested in, was to someday become a pilot, and hopefully an airline pilot. But it was as somebody once told me, there's the easy way, the hard way, and then there's the Baur way. So it was the Baur way. That was the route that I took.
I see. Okay, fantastic. Tell me more about Hughes Aerospace. Obviously, it's become one of the most respected air navigation service providers globally. Can you share what makes your approach to flight procedure design and validation that is unique to, say, other providers?
Certainly. We've been around for almost 20 years. And as a pioneer in performance-based navigation, which is the fusion of satellites and using computers in an aircraft to create flight paths. And the flight paths in the old days were based on radio aids, or we would call them today legacy aids, that are radio stations that were installed on the ground that pilots either listened to or got an instrument visualization that allowed them to fly in a line between to and from a station, or radial emanating out from the station. And that was how we navigated until very recently. And the FAA promoted the idea of NextGen, where we could shift this to a space-based system that would be more accurate, safer, and provide greater flexibility. And as you know, if you go to a college campus and you had to walk between buildings, there would be the sidewalk, but then you would look through the grass and there's probably a beaten path that is shorter, that maybe doesn't go in a straight line, that allows you to go between the buildings quicker. And that is sort of the way we operate as human beings. Whether we believe it or not, we try to be efficient. And the mind says, well, I want to go from here to there, but I want to get there as quick as I can and with the fewest amount of steps possible. So flying, you're doing the same thing. You want to get where you're going as quickly and safely as possible. And that's what the next gen movement allowed us to do, and particularly performance-based navigation was trajectory-based flight operations. So we no longer were stuck tracking radials inbound and outbound. The other thing it did, aside from enhancing safety, increasing throughput at airports, is it opened up a way that helicopters, which, by the way, I think are the only pure form of transportation, because you could fly between two places without a road, without a body of water, without a runway, but you could go from A to B in this machine. So now we could create three-dimensional path in space that would allow the helicopter to do that safely in all different weather conditions and day and night. So this was a great opportunity to harness what you could do with the accuracy of the satellite, updating a database installed in the aircraft that would allow the aircraft to have a known position, say a 95% or greater probability that the aircraft would stay within a margin of error of, say, 2 times whatever the required navigation performance value is. And for the sake of this conversation, I'd say it's a nominal 0.6 of a mile. And it didn't matter how high or low you were, because with old legacy nav aids that were based on radio signals, the further you got away from the station, the higher you needed to be because it was line of sight, and the less accurate it would be. So you would have to cut out great swaths of airspace to enable aircraft to navigate and keep them separated from each other. Now, and I won't get into ADS-B, but which is automatic dependent broadcast, but now you could get aircraft safely closer together, and you could reduce unnecessary track miles, which save fuel. And when you're saving fuel, you're reducing hydrocarbon emissions. So all of this was very safe, friendly, and it was a transformation as to the way the pilots flew. And I became involved with this more than 20 years ago. And I will say that 20 years ago, there were plenty of people on the sidelines throwing rotten eggs and tomatoes at folks like me, saying what was wrong with this and why we needed to, the world was definitely flat and we needed to stick with that plan. So here we are today, innovating how we can use this technology to do things. Like, I had a customer that came and they wanted to be able to land their seaplane at their home. But the lake was a moving body of water and the elevation of it changed. And we were able to innovate a way to create the first procedure that would give the aircraft vertical guidance to a surface of moving water.
Okay.
We've done that with helicopters to a floating vessel. We've done that in mountains in Alaska. We've done that in mountains in Colorado. We've done that in some very congested airspace where we're able to design flight paths for not only airliners and corporate aircraft, but for air ambulances and automated or autonomous flying vehicles.
Excellent. Wow, that's exciting. Your FAA and ICAO, that's ICAO, certify for both PANSOP and TERPS. And for those of you that don't understand what this is, it's okay. For those outside the industry, what is the significance that of this, and how does it affect global aviation safety? So maybe you could first describe very quickly what PANSOP means and what TERPS criteria are, and then for those that doesn't know what this means.
Well, that's a good place to start. So starting with ICAO, you have the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is part of the UN. and they're responsible for harmonizing all the different rules and regulations that affect flying. So if you fly from one country to another, it's safe, and they have treaties. And you have the United States as part of this, and this is ICAO is part of the United Nations. So there's different cookbooks. So when you design procedure, you could use PANSOP's criteria, which is different than what the US offers, which is TERPS. TERPS stands for Terminal Instrument Procedures. And PANSOP's was created by ICAO and some of the other member states. I'll say it's sort of complementary. So if you were baking a pie, you could follow one recipe, you could follow another recipe. Neither recipe is better than the other intrinsically, but there are some differences. And the differences are simply how you create a path. So going back to the college path that went through the campus, you could start getting into splitting hairs. How wide is the path that goes between the science and the music building? You know, is it wide enough for two people to walk, or is it a single file? Does it need to be wider? Does it need to be less of a slope? Does it go over anything that's uneven? So when you design an instrument flight procedure, you collect a bunch of data. Earlier in the podcast, you mentioned obstacles. So terrain and obstacles play a big factor in developing an instrument flight procedure, and the accuracy, if you have a database with obstacles, how accurate is that obstacle data? In the United States, in TERPS, they have a different standard, say, than PANSOPS does. And in the United States, if we have an obstacle, and let's say it's a water tank, the water tank could be a 1A, and it could go all the way out to 9I. 1A means we know where the obstacle is within 20 feet on the ground or 10 feet in its height, elevation. And Hughes has a letter of authority from the FAA that we are able to go out into the field and help the FAA by identifying obstacles that they didn't know were in their database, or obstacles that they held in their database that have been removed. Like we had a procedure we were building, and I think it was in North Carolina. And one of the obstacles we had to look at that was not on the airport or the heliport was a smokestack at a power station. And we went by the power station, and there was no smokestack there anymore. It turns out it was torn down. They were no longer using it. But the FAA didn't know that, and it wasn't reflected in their database. So we're allowed to go in and provide the FAA with all these data points saying, you have this tower, radio tower, that radio tower was dismantled 2 years ago. It's no longer an obstacle. Or we found 3 other towers you didn't know existed, and here's their locations. And now we can put that with accuracy into the database. So by having that information, we're able to design an instrument flight procedure that's safe because it accounts for these obstacles. And we can design a procedure that gives you the lowest minimums. And that's kind of the money shot.
Okay.
They say there's nothing worse than a dull knife, right?
Yeah.
That's dangerous. You'll cut yourself with it. And a crummy instrument approach is a dull knife. You look at a project we did in Eagle, Colorado, where you had some federal approaches that had very high minimums, and they didn't line up with the runway. So the aircraft approached the runway at an angle, which at night can be confusing to the pilot.
Sure, absolutely.
And I'll tell you, a million years ago, when I got a captain checkout on this airport, they said, you'll see the Costco parking lot lights. And if you have to do something like that's not a really good procedure. I mean, so we went in and we designed a whole slate of new procedures that would be aligned with the runway, that would have lower minimums. But one of the most challenging things about instrument approaches into airports where you have terrain or other artifacts is the missed approach. And it's often overlooked, but the missed approach is where pilots sometimes get in trouble because a tricky missed approach that requires an immediate turn, and then you have to climb over something like a mountain. The pilot makes a mistake, and often these accidents are occurring if you look at data on the missed approach segment of the approach. So we developed a process of making these missed approaches much safer, easier to fly, and account also for things like maybe you lose an engine and you have less thrust, that you're able to fly the missed approach with an engine inoperative. So these are kind of game changers for the airports and the pilots that fly in there, that they're flying an approach that they have a good chance of completing the mission and not going missed approach and then going into holding or having a mishap.
Okay, fantastic. You also design and maintain IFR approaches for heliports, which is a very niche, but a very critical area. What are the challenges and innovations in creating safe, reliable helicopter access in urban as well as remote areas in that environment?
Well, whether you're creating them in an urban area or a remote area, sometimes we start out and it's just a pile of dirt. And we work with the proponent that wants that to create the heliport and all of the architecture that goes into developing it. Sometimes it could be something as simple as a field that the helicopter is going to land in that's designated as a heliport. They really kind of run the gamut. I mean, you can have something that is the roof of a building, and you can have something that's prefabricated, that's made out of aluminum, that contains all the lighting. It has a heated deck that prevents contamination in foul weather, and it has a fire suppression system built into it. So it runs the gamut from anything from concrete and sod to aluminum, steel. And what the aircraft wants to do is be able to have a slope, and we'll call it an 8-to-1 slope, which, by the way, I think the concept is a little outdated in the modern era, but it goes back to second generation, third generation helicopters, that they needed a slope where you had no obstacles within that area that would allow the helicopter to descend and ascend, coming and going from the heliport. So the first order of business when you have one of these is how many obstacles are there around the facility? And if you don't have an instrument flight procedure, whether it's a runway or a heliport, we'll call it an aerodrome, you do not protect the airspace above it from obstacle proliferation. So you can have a very expensive runway, but if you don't have an instrument approach, someone can come along and put an obstacle up, whether it's a cell tower or a wind turbine or a set of power lines. Any of those obstacles can show up at your doorstep because you're not protecting the airspace. And the only way to do that is if you're building or have an existing instrument flight procedure. So that would be, I'd say, the biggest challenge when you look at a site is, does it have a lot of obstacles around it? And if it does, what are they? And can they be removed or mitigated?
Okay, fantastic. You also have, well, I should say your company was one of the first to implement practical solutions in the performance-based navigation and satellite-based flight procedures. What's the next evolution that you think in air navigation, and how is Hughes positioned to lead this?
Well, there's a few things that we're doing that are very innovative, several.
Excited to hear about it.
One of them is advanced RNP or ARNP. And advanced RNP is the segue for non-airline aircraft. I'll use the term loosely. You know, an aircraft, it could be a large business jet or an airliner, would typically have avionics that would allow it to fly RNP or required navigation performance procedures, which are based on using inertial reference systems, flight management computers, and using the GPS signal. So raw GPS, as we use it, is accurate to within about 20 meters. But if you can augment the signal through differential GPS. That would account for the fact that the Earth isn't truly round. So you have an ellipsoid that is more accurate than the actual surface or MSL altitude. So when you can correct for that and correct for ionospheric signal position and clock errors of GPS through differential, which in the United States, we use a space-based augmentation system called WAAS. And WAAS stands for wide area augmentation. And that brings the accuracy down to within 1 or 2 meters. So what Hughes is doing is working with the FAA to leverage the WAAS constellation to allow general aviation aircraft and helicopters to fly these trajectory-based approaches with curved paths and a required navigation performance of 0.3 of a mile. This first one that we built was up in Juneau in Alaska, and we have others that are in development. And what that allows the airplane to do is access a runway that they never had access to before. Like in the case of Juneau, there's no approach to runway 26 that's public. And they have one public approach to runway 8, but it's offset and the minimums on it are like 3,000 feet and 4 miles of visibility. It's not much in terms of an instrument approach. And we're able to develop an approach that would get you down to visibility of below a mile and an altitude of less than 300 feet or 300 feet. And that lines up with the runway. So it's much safer and it's much easier for the pilot and the controller to issue a clearance for something like that. So we're working with the FAA to come out with the public criteria for advanced RNP. We just built the first advanced RNP helicopter approach in Texas, as well as having this procedure up in Juneau. We also formed a partnership with Garmin, and we are producing a line of guided visual approaches. So more than 20 years ago, I worked with the FAA at the time to create what's called the RNAV Visual Flight Procedure, or RVFP. At the time, we had data that came off the aircraft. And when we flew old aircraft, by the way, we didn't know how bad we were until computers came along and you had all these recorded data parameters that showed if the aircraft was too high or too fast or where it touched down on the runway. And once we started looking at this data, we realized that when you had to fly a trajectory-based approach, something that was curved to a runway, that a lot of mistakes were being made. So I had the idea that you could use the flight management computer and we could code the path and put it in there for the pilots to use to help better manage the energy of the aircraft. At first, the reception was sort of tepid to it, and then it really took off when people saw that this made flying a whole lot safer. So now, in spinning the clock forward 20 years, we want to make this available to general aviation aircraft. So when you have a challenging runway, that you can have accessibility to the runway using the flight management system that's already in your aircraft. All you needed now to make that happen was a database that has the path in there in 3 dimensions that will take you safely to the touchdown zone, and a georeference chart that has on-ship display on it that shows your performance. And this would allow a pilot to couple up to an autopilot if they choose, and then look outside. So they're not so focused on flying over various waypoints on the ground, but looking outside for other aircraft. So much, much safer. And we were able to bring this to market together.
Fantastic. So let's continue on. You've flown everything from commercial airlines to helicopters to UAVs, and even led the longest helicopter oceanic rescue in history. Can you take us back to that mission and what it taught you about that particular mission, leadership, decision-making, all of that?
Well, I'd say when you're young, you do some crazy things.
Yes, I definitely agree with that.
So with time, when age, I think comes wisdom. But at the time, I was 33 years old. I was a treasury agent working an undercover financial and narcotics case
Okay.
and had a little bit of time off in that role to go out and fly in my guard squadron. And what happened was there was a vessel called the Salvador Allende, which is interesting because at the time, this is at the end of the Cold War, right? You have what we thought were Russians, but I guess at the time it was Ukraine, had a merchant marine vessel that was built in East Germany and named after a communist dictator, Salvador Allende, that had 31 merchant marines on board, and it was about 1,500 miles east of Montauk Point, New York. And the word came to us through the Coast Guard that this vessel was sinking and that they were abandoning ship. And did we have the ability to fly out that far to it because the Coast Guard didn't have that capability? And at the time, I said yes, it could be done. But the decision was made that night that we weren't going to be the first to do something like that. And what I didn't know until years later is the person I wanted to fly in this rescue mission with had actually taken off on his own and then turned around and came back. And I got a phone call and somebody said, I don't want to go do this. I have a family. Would you take my place? Which I did. And I remember calling my mother to quasi, I guess, say goodbye. I didn't really know how it would work out. I was, thinking it should work out, but just in case, I thought I'd let her know a few things before I left. And I took off and we flew to Canada and we landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We got up the next morning in a snowstorm and took off before dark and flew out to a position that we were told where the quote unquote Russians would be waiting for us in wooden lifeboats. And we got out to that part of the ocean. There was nobody waiting for us. And
Wow.
we were told under no circumstances were we to be a search. We were just a rescue asset, not a search asset. And that anyway, I disobeyed orders and came up with a search pattern.
Okay.
And I had a lot of experience at the time from serving previously in the Coast Guard and having gone through different schools that the Coast Guard offered, on-scene commander and how to generate search patterns, and came up with one. And we searched along this fuel slick that I found. And we were supposed to turn around, and I think it was noon, because they didn't want us refueling at night to make it back to Halifax. So we disobeyed that. So we went hundreds of miles beyond where we were supposed to be. And it was around 2:30 in the afternoon. And the flight engineer said, hey, there's some debris over there waving at us. And that's how we got to meet a gentleman named Alexander Taranov, who was treading water. The on-scene conditions, the ceiling varied from around 100 feet. It was raining. The seas were running about 30-foot swells, huge swells, and the wind was just really blowing at in excess probably of 30 to 50 knots, depending on where in the area we're talking about. So we extracted Alexander Taranov from the water. What we also didn't think about was that we were so far out, we were in the Gulf Stream, which is how we ultimately survived the water temperature. And the water was full of sharks. And the sharks were feeding on the other crew members. So we got Alexander and we got our PJ back in the helicopter. They'd tied themselves together with rope. And we were watching a shark basically hit one of them and then pull the other ones underwater, and it's a little bit of a carnage. So we were fortunate to get Alexander, and then we had to fly back through the storm to get to Halifax. So it was a little over 16 hours of flying with 10 midair refuelings from 4 different tankers. And Alexander wrote a very nice letter. Power Up Magazine, which is a part of VAI, they wrote an article where they interviewed me during COVID about the rescue, and it has a copy of that letter in there that Alexander had written with a Reader's Digest author while he was in the hospital in Nova Scotia.
Hmm.
When we first made the sight of land again, which is very interesting. I was, you're so far gone. I felt like an astronaut returning from space when I first saw the lights of Halifax. And he said, America. And we said, no, Canada. And he was completely befuddled as to why the Americans would come out and rescue him and then take him to Canada. But I don't think he understood the geography of it.
Okay. Wow. Because of that particular mission, you have won, or you've been awarded the Valor for the mission that you've completed. So,
That's not true.
okay, let's talk about that.
So what happened was, after this mission, which is still the longest rescue mission in history, I mean, if you think about it, the probability of detection of a human being in the water, person in the water, there's very little freeboard, if you will, like you would have on a vessel for
Right.
a person's head that's bobbing in the water. And we found a human being in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in a storm, a nor'easter. The probability of that is immeasurable, yet it was done. And the distance involved in flying that, and it had never been done before. So in doing all this and bringing the crew back safely, not losing an aircraft and not losing, the chance to rescue another person, we were told that we were going to be awarded the DFC, or the Distinguished Flying Cross. And we were then told later on that after they assembled an award ceremony and invited all these people, including our families, as we were to step outside, they said, we have something bad to tell you. We're going to pin a medal on you, but you're going to have to give it back to us.
Oh.
Because the Pentagon decided they're not going to award the Distinguished Flying Cross for this rescue because it was in peacetime.
Oh, I see. Oh.
So the medal that I got that you're mentioning, the Medal of Valor, was actually awarded by Attorney General Janet Reno for a different mission that I flew when I was with the Treasury Department.
I see.
And we were out doing a patrol. We used to patrol offshore quite a bit, looking for different things, particularly vessels. And a call. So being a former Coast Guard, I used to take our tactical radios and change the frequencies on them sometimes, reprogram it to listen to the marine distress frequency when I was out offshore. And this one time was flying offshore and had it set up, and this call came in. It was a vessel, it was in distress, and they were sinking in I'll call it heavy sea conditions. So the problem was, the master of this vessel, the skipper, was giving his position in what's called time delays, or TDs, which is something ships use. So when they navigate, back then they used Loran, and there was something called a time delay, which was the time it took the signal to go from the station to the vessel. What I needed was his coordinates as a latitude and longitude so I could find him. Ultimately, I was able to communicate with this guy and get him to give me his position. And when we got there, the boat had sunk, and there was 3 fishermen in the water, and this was off the coast of Cape Cod. And myself and a gentleman named Mike Brenner were flying together, and Mike said, I guess we could, drop the life raft. We carry an emergency life raft in the back of the aircraft. And we came up with this plan to open the door in flight, fly as low as we could over the water, and time the departure of the raft out of the aircraft to the fishermen so they could live.
I see. Okay.
So that was another case of me, by the way, getting in trouble initially for breaking some rules. But ultimately, Janet Reno and the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association gave us this very nice award for valor.
Okay. Which is the Medal of Valor. Fantastic. Thank you for clearing that up. You've also served as the industry co-chairman for the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. What are some of the top safety challenges and opportunities facing the rotorcraft industry today?
Well, there's lots of challenges, and some of them have been around for a while.
Mhm.
Our goal is to eliminate fatal accidents.
Okay.
I want to eliminate accidents altogether, but in particularly, when you look at why helicopters have fatal accidents, just like with airplanes, it often comes down to human factors, poor
Sure.
decisions, and even a very competent pilot can have a bad day where they make a decision that leads, we'll call it a chain of errors. Hopefully that chain of errors gets broken at some point, but if it doesn't, it often leads to tragedy. Uh,
Mhm.
you and I earlier were talking about the Kobe Bryant crash, and that
Sure.
was a preventable tragedy. What we
Yes.
see in a lot of these helicopter accidents in terms of those challenges are continued VFR flight into instrument meteorological conditions. And I've been a very strong proponent over the years of giving helicopters access to airspace, access to instrument flight procedures that are designed and tailored for them. One of the things we created, aside from modern navigation for the helicopters, is low-level airways for them, called the ZK routes. And we worked with the FAA on the criteria, and we even proved it out flying our own helicopter, collecting data and showing how this low-altitude airway could keep helicopters out of icing condition, but safe from impacting terrain and create these networks. Another thing that helps prevent accidents is the use of the FAA's weather camera network. And this is a challenge because the FAA, by their own metric, they claim that these weather cameras have reduced fatal accidents by 80%. What a significant payback that is on your return on your investment. Yet, most of these cameras are not located in the United States. They're in Alaska, there's a bunch in Hawaii, and there's some states where they do have some cameras. But by and large, we're missing cameras. And I'm advocating that the weather camera program be expanded
Mhm.
and these cameras have sufficient densities in all the lower 48 that help pilots make go and no-go decisions. They're often able to look at the camera and see that it's not safe to fly and make a decision to stay on the ground, which can prevent inadvertent IMC. Oftentimes, helicopters fly between non-airport locations where there's not weather reporting. So these cameras are a very cost-effective means of doing that. So that's part of this advocacy that I work on. Another one that we launched at Hughes supporting the USHST was I launched a thing called the Peer Pilot Mental Health Program for helicopter pilots. And
Oh,
you're
wow.
probably aware there's been a lot of news about the FAA, and they had an arc to talk about mental health, which had been sort of taboo, that pilots weren't allowed to have any mental health issues. So you've had some tragedies because of that. In the helicopter community, we did not have an independent peer pilot program for helicopter pilots. It didn't exist. And this was one of the things that I wanted to create when I became the industry chairman of the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, was this peer pilot program. So we've stood that up. Last March, we announced it at Verticon in Dallas that we had kicked this program off free of charge to any helicopter pilot that's encountering turbulence in their life, and then they could talk to a trained and qualified peer. And you would have to agree, David, that if you can prevent an accident from happening, you're a whole lot better off than talking about after the fact what went wrong.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
Hughes supports
Hindsight's
that
always
program.
2020. Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
We also do a lot with the FAA FAST team, and we do webinars, we write scripts for videos, we film videos. We also partnered with Airbus and Push to Talk series, making podcasts about different safety topics that pilots can learn about and read about, either as a tool for an instructor with a student, or a student that wants to learn more, or somebody that wants to refresh themselves about loss of aircraft control, pre-flight planning. We just did a webinar last weekend on coffee and wings, that talked about pre-flighting the helicopter and some of the traps that pilots can fall into and things you can miss. So it's Hughes is very much involved in much more than just building instrument flight procedures. We're also involved with supporting the community and seeing where we can provide our resources for safety and try to prevent accidents from happening.
Okay, fantastic. So as emerging technologies like unmanned aerial systems, UAS, and advanced air mobility, AAM, grow, how are regulatory bodies and providers like your firm, Hughes, prepare for safe integration into the national airspace and, in fact, global airspace?
Well, I don't know anyone else other than Hughes who's working on that part of the instrument ticket, if you will, to do this. But without getting any rocks thrown at me, I'm going to say, as people will portray eVTOLs as being different, and they are, there's still aircraft that fly. And a lot of what we know from flying helicopters and operating them can help the eVTOL industry in terms of how we come up with flight paths, trajectories, a lot of discussion about vertiport. In fact, Hughes was recently bestowed by the FAA two things. One is we can now train personnel in-house and certify them to go out and do all these inspections that we're talking about, where in the past we would send someone to an FAA school. Now Hughes has the ability to train people in-house and certify them. So we can focus better on the technology. And also, we were now certified to certify a vertiport.
Certify to certify. Got it.
There you go. So we can go out and do this work. I try to draw parallels of things that are common more than figure out what the differences are. And the challenges are going to be how long something can fly. If it can't land where you have an intended landing point, where's the alternate for that? How does it get there? What kind of weather can it operate in safely? And what kind of weather conditions can it operate in safely? And then it takes time, once you do have these vehicles operating, to garner experience in them. There's so many things you don't know until you start flying or flying a particular aircraft. So it's going to take time. It's going to take resources to do that. And I think you will see a commonality probably with the operation of helicopters and eVTOLs in the same airspace using overlapping facilities.
It's going to be busy airspace there. You've seen aviation evolve dramatically across decades of service in this particular industry. If you could give one piece of advice for future aviation entrepreneurs or innovators or aviators, what would that be?
Well, first of all, thank you, and we need you. You know,
Amen.
the younger generation, and I hope to inspire and cultivate the next generation, because we need pilots, we need maintainers, we need air traffic controllers, we need everybody, all the different facets of the industry. And I just didn't do it justice. I rattled off, you know, a couple of different careers, but there's thousands of careers in aviation. And it's only going to be successful when new people come in with new ideas and new strengths, and the opportunities are there. When I started flying in the late 70s, the bar to entry wasn't the same as it is today, in that you could go to a local airport and you could sign up and you could take lessons and learn how to fly, or you could go in the military. But if you look today, you know, people aren't picking up this profession like they once did. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I would certainly encourage them to. You're going to see just massive retirements of people in aviation as the baby boomers, which I'm part of, as we age out. And there's no group of people behind us that we can see that are going to pick up the torch and continue it.
Sure. And finally, where can listeners connect with you or learn more about the work at Hughes Aerospace is doing in global aerospace innovation?
Well, we have a social media presence, but our website is hughesaerospace.com.
Okay.
And you can go there and read about what we're doing in terms of instrument flight procedure design, the new procedures we're creating for noise abatement. We just did a project in Naples, Florida, that was very successful. You can also download and install the Hughes app. It's free. And the Hughes app has a whole bunch of safety tools in it. We just created one and launched it prior to MBA base called the VFR prediction tool.
Mhm.
And by the way, the idea for this, I won't take credit for it, but the idea came from David Smith from Robinson Helicopter. And he and I had met, and he said, I have this idea for a tool that a helicopter pilot can use. So we went back and figured out how we could create that tool and include it in the Hughes app and then give it to pilots for free. So in the Hughes app, there's a tool where a pilot could put in where they're going to fly between 2 points, and it will go in and pull weather from various stations, and through an algorithm will figure out what your probability of VFR flight would be, icing conditions, if you're going to fly at night, what the moon illumination looks like for night vision goggle pilots. We're in the process right now of adding a migratory bird prediction tool that'll be part of it. But yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that is out there that people can read about us and certainly communicate through us, either through the app or through our website.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a remarkable journey from heroic missions in the air to building one of the most innovative companies in global air navigation services. To our listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Hughes Aerospace Corporation or explore how they're shaping the future of flight safety and aerospace innovations, we'll include all of that in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a rating and review, and make sure to subscribe to Jet Setting Wealth Advisory so you never miss an interview with leaders that are shaping aviation, wealth, and the future. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. See you next time. And of course, always live life with purpose.
Thank you for flying with us on today's episode of Jet Setting Wealth Advisory. If you enjoyed your journey through the fiscal skies with David T.U., don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and keep your financial knowledge soaring. For more insights and personalized advice, visit us at www.dtywealthplanningsolutions.com and connect with David directly